In this set of lectures, I'm going to be describing a little bit about ecology, and I'd like to start just by defining what is ecology. Ecology is a scientific study of the interactions between organisms and their environments. So it's sort of, this definition has three parts. It is still a scientific discipline, it's a scientific study, and we're focused on how things interact with each other. So we could be talking about birds, about plants, insects, people, any sort of living thing has to interact with its environment. And so what we're going to do is take a look at different types of interactions that can exist. Interactions can happen at many different levels. Let's just look at some of the different levels that interactions can take place at. We could look at one specific organism and think about its interactions, or we could move up in complexity. We could think about groups of organisms. So if we move up to talking about a group of individuals of the same species, the way that we would refer to that is call it a population. So we could talk about this population of penguins, again, groups of animals of the same species. That's the key thing when talking about a population. Moving up even further in the hierarchy, we could consider other living things that inhabit the same area. So a community includes all of the living things that exist in one particular area. Maybe it's a meadow, maybe it's some other habitat, but in any case, a community is multiple species in the same area. And then ecosystem. Ecosystems are basically just communities plus the non-living resources that exist in that area. So abiotic factors. We'll focus on those in just a second. For now, just know they are the non-living factors. And then finally, if we just finish out our list here, the biosphere. The biosphere is the global ecosystem, right? So there are many ecosystems spread throughout the earth. Take them all as a whole, and that's considered the biosphere. Let's focus in on these abiotic factors. What do we mean by abiotic factors? Abiotic means non-living, so non-living factors. Non-living factors exist in environments, and they influence what living things can do with a particular environment. So for example, if there's water available in a given region, or if there's not water available, water is not alive, so water would be considered an abiotic factor. A couple of other examples. Energy sources, so availability of sunlight, that would be another example of an abiotic factor. That in turn influences the temperature of a given habitat. Water availability again, and then inorganic nutrients. This one is particularly relevant for plants. So availability of nitrogen and phosphorus in the soil. Those are things that influence whether plants live in a given region or not. If we are talking about aquatic habitats particularly, then other sorts of abiotic factors would come into play, such as how much oxygen is there in the water, what's the salinity, is the water moving or is it not moving? Those would be abiotic factors specific to aquatic habitats. If we're talking about on the land, so terrestrial habitats, in that case, two other things become very important. Wind and fire. Those are abiotic factors that are specifically relevant in terrestrial habitats. So, in general, organisms choose where to live based on availability of certain abiotic factors. So these abiotic factors drive living things to live in certain areas. So that kind of brings up the question, let's say we have some living things in a given area, and what if the abiotic factors change? What next? There are a few different ways that living things can respond to abiotic factors changing. And we're going to break it down into three major ways that living things could respond. There are physiological responses, so things that can change within an organism's own physiology. For example, with us, when we are cold, when we go outside in the winter and it's cold out, then what happens is our our physiology changes in order to try and conserve heat. So what will happen is our blood vessels near the surface, they constrict. That brings the blood closer in towards the center of the body, and it helps to prevent us from losing heat to the environment. So that would be an example of a physiological change. Other sorts of changes can take place too, not just based on physiology. We can actually have anatomical responses. A great example of this is if you look at trees that exist in areas where there is wind. If there is consistently wind coming from one particular direction, then the trees will actually change which side they grow branches on. So typically when you think of a tree, you think branches coming off in each in pretty much every direction equally, but take a look at this tree right here. This tree has, this is called flagging. It has changed the pattern of branch growth. So the wind, in this case, the wind would be coming from the left, it would sweep to the right, and over time the tree just essentially it stops growing branches on that side. So think about if there was a branch on that side and if the wind comes along, what's that going to do? It's going to bend that branch, potentially snap, and that would not be a good thing. That's a wound that could potentially become infected for the tree. So that's an example of an anatomical response. Other examples of anatomical responses would include things like some organisms change the color of their fur in different seasons. So that's definitely an anatomical change. And then finally, just to finish out our list here of possible ways living things can respond, behavioral responses. This is extremely common. This is very widespread in people as well as in animals. So coming back to temperature as an example, if the temperature changes, let's just say for people, if it becomes hot, like it's about to do in the summer, if it becomes warm, then what do? Instead of just hanging out outside, you tend to move inside where it is cooler. Animals do the same thing. Rabbits tend to move into the shade if it's a hot day. So those are behavioral responses. We're changing our behavior in response to these abiotic factors that have changed in the environment.